For he who does reverence to his own sect while disparaging the sects of others in reality inflicts the severest of injury on his own sect. These words of Emperor Ashoka, chiseled into stone over 2 millennia ago, resonate with a remarkable level of relevance in our present day. In his inscriptions, Ashoka admits his violent past and informs us about his spiritual transformation. He comes across as a benevolent and caring ruler whose concerns extend far beyond the political and territorial realms. He sees the welfare of his subjects, and not just human subjects, but also the animals, as his responsibility. He wants the people to live up to a high moral standard for their own good, not just in this life, but also in the afterlife. In his edicts, he demands uniformity in law and uniformity in sentencing and argues for kindness to prisoners, talks of planting shady trees and digging freshwater wells, building shelters and medical facilities for men and animals, and so much more. He claims to be a father to his subjects that he sees as his children. It is hard not to imagine the times under him as a long lost golden age. And yet, like anything that sounds too good to be true, there are reasons to doubt this view of Ashoka as an ideal statesman. We are shown a very different side of Ashoka by the Sanskrit text Ashoka Vedana from Mathura and the Buddhist chronicle Mahavamsa from Sri Lanka and other contemporary and later sources. They tell us about the brutal religious persecutions unleashed by Ashoka against Jains, Ajivikas, and those he considered to be heretical Buddhists. They share tales about him executing concubines, burning dissidents alive, his torture cells and his executioners, the multiple uprisings and their brutal repressions. The picture that comes across is not of a righteous ruler of a glorious empire, but a cruel and unpopular tyrant who presided over a police state. So we at Argumentative Indians decided to put the question to one of India's most eminent historians, Professor Irfan Habib. Does Ashoka deserve the epithet great conferred on him in modern times? So of course, these Buddhist texts cannot be taken at their word as they clearly had a proselytizing agenda. But nor can we trust Ashoka's edicts just as we cannot trust the TV ads run by modern politicians. Similarly, the studies done on Ashoka in modern times by colonial Orientalists and the Indian nationalists were far from objective. They all cherry-picked from limited evidence available to create an ancient Emperor Ashoka they needed for their political objectives. The process still goes on. How do we unearth the real Ashoka who lays buried below so many layers of myths and propaganda? Kindly enlighten us, Professor Habib. Welcome back to Argumentative Indians. It's an honor to have you with us again, sir.
Yes. How much time do I have?
You can take your time. I suggest that you lay out your case and then over the next 20, 30 minutes, and then we can sort of, after that, do a more of a question
So let's
answer.
say 25 minutes, right?
Perfect.
Well, friends, I'm very grateful to be having this opportunity to speak on Ashoka. Like Surendranath Banerjee, I still think that India had two major rulers, and that is the names Ashoka and Akbar. And they also appear so often in our nationalist days when we cited them for the ability of Indians to govern themselves. However, when we look at Ashoka, we must look at hard evidence. And the first thing that we should notice, and probably usually ignore, is that past culture needed particular occasions 2 or 3 major inventions. And one of the major inventions needed was writing. As we know, it had two origins, China and Mesopotamia. India didn't have writing. We had ideographs in Indus civilization, which we can't read. It's forgotten that it is Ashoka who brings writing to India, a very major element of change. It's a very simple matter of fact, but is often ignored. Now, Ashoka used for his major part of a major number of inscriptions, the Brahmi script, which is actually the mother script of all Indian scripts, except the Urdu script, the Arabic script, which is used in Urdu and Kashmiri languages and Sindhi languages. But even for Urdu scripts, Ashoka had another Kharoshthi script, which is a member of that family. So you have here the man who brought writing to India, and he used writing extensively. His written edicts are there's nothing like that earlier in any earlier Indian civilization. It's totally new. There have been now debates about how Brahmi script came to India. There are claims about Brahmi symbols being present, Brahmi letters being present in Sri Lanka and then now in Tamil Nadu. But they are only present in words, not in texts. And then, of course, Ashokan Brahmi is different. It has a system of providing for verbs, which you now find in all Indian languages, including Hindi. If I had time, I would illustrate how Brahmi has laid down the principles on which practically every Indian language script, except the Arabic script, is based on. So Ashoka's first major achievement is that not only he introduces writing in India, he uses two scripts. He's the first to use the two scripts in India, Brahmi and Kharoshthi. And he's the first person who spreads his message through writing. All Indian works earlier were remembered, were passed from one memorizer to another, and therefore often have been lost. It's Ashoka who establishes writing in India. And it's a tremendous change that is brought about in administration. For that reason, you can say, of course, that the administration could have become more efficient and therefore more effective and more cruel, but that is another issue. The fact that major part of our literature has been preserved of earlier times is because Ashoka gave us writing, and he gave us two major scripts also. The second point that I would like to stress about Ashoka is that he's crucial for our reconstruction of history. History is an important subject. It's national memory. The more truthful the memory, the better. And it is Ashoka's inscriptions, particularly Rock Edict 13, which establishes chronology. Without chronology, you can not have history. You must see what event preceded what event. And therefore, Ashoka is not only important for the historian, he is also important for Indian culture and for our understanding of Indian cultural history, for because we must say which event came first and which came later. It's often forgotten that Ashoka is the first person who uses an era. There were no eras, no numbered years before him. He took it from the Greeks, but he's the first Indian to use the dating system. And therefore, basically establishes ancient Indian chronology. It is his mention of the 5 Greek rulers, Macedonian rulers, in his Rock Edict 13 that really establishes the political chronology of India. And therefore, all chronology, even if you go to Buddha's date of death, the Mauryan chronology is essential. So Ashoka introduces not only writing, he introduces also the dating system. He establishes the chronology. He is an Indian, and he does it because he's in contact with rulers as far as Egypt and Greece. So he's a totally new person, totally important person before we even come to his edicts. Now, of course, we know him from his edicts. And that's in Ashoka very different from the Ashoka portrayed in both the Theravada texts, beginning with Deepavamsha and Sri Lanka, and the Ashoka Vidvana of the Mahayana tradition. First of all, these two traditions are totally different. They often don't meet except on very bare facts. And so you can't actually say that there is a single Buddhist tradition. There are 2 Buddhist traditions which are at variance with each other. And most serious historians therefore ignore them. They are mythical constructions of the 1000 years succeeding Ashoka. We must go to his inscriptions. And therefore, the first thing that meets our inscriptions is what he's appealing to. What is his mission? That his mission is, in these inscriptions, not the spread of Buddhism. Actually, there's only one rock inscriptions at the Bharat rock, so-called Bharat rock edict, in which Ashoka even says that he is a Buddhist. He declares his belief in Gautama, in the Buddha, in the Dharma and the Sangha, the threefold admission of faith for Buddhists. But that's the only inscription. In fact, if you look at most of the inscriptions, you would not necessarily feel that a Buddhist is speaking. Because his Dhamma is not about Nirvana. His Dhamma, or what is now not in Sanskrit was called Dharma, but he uses the word Dhamma, the Prakrit word. His Dhamma is not about Nirvana or Nibbana, the extermination of self. His whole message is one of mercy and peaceable relationship. If you assemble the what he was wanting his subjects to do under the slogan of Dhamma, then the first thing on which the references are most numerous is that he's asking for mercy for living beings. And those living beings include for him also animals. He's not only asking for vegetarianism. Of course, there's no proof, there's no statement of his that no animal should be slaughtered. But in his inscriptions, he's indicating various ways in which animal slaughter may be minimized and animals not be hurt. But basically, it is not mercy for animals, it is mercy for human beings. We must remember that in Rock Edict number 13, in which he says why he turned to the cause of Dhamma, the cause of mercy, he says because he invaded Kalinga, or what is Odisha now, and in the invasion and conquest, 150,000 people were enslaved, 100,000 were killed, another 100,000 died, and therefore a huge human slaughter and suffering took place. It was this which turned him to respect the value of life. So let us remember what Ashoka puts as a basic factor behind his cause, behind his taking the cause. And then if we look at other principles of Dhamma, apart from mercy for all living beings, especially human beings first, then these are moral principles on which there could hardly be any difference. Respect your parents, mother and father. Of course, this doesn't mean that mothers were preferred, because even now in our Hindi belt, we say Ma Baap, although we hardly care for the mother. But so the parents, respect for the parents, that's the first important thing. Then for others, and then very notably, bringing in slaves and servants, dasa. Very important. Look at the whole of Arthashastra. There's nothing about mercy for slaves and servants. Even Manusmriti. So this is a totally new ethics. Of course, incidentally, he says those above you should be obeyed. Incidentally, he says, includes other things also, care for, you can perhaps bring out about 11 or 12 major principles, but they are all about well-treating or respecting others. There's nothing about caste duties. It's amazing that Ashoka doesn't refer to the caste system at all. There's nothing about jatis. Caste system is not a part of Ashoka's Dhamma. I think that is a very major piece of importance. It is not, he's not pleading for Buddhism. The word Nibbana or Nirvana is not used by him. He says that if you follow these methods, morals, my moral teaching, then because of your good deeds, you will have a good future life, praloka, or heaven, swarga, or swarg. That is to say, he's appealing not to system of transmigration, not to the theory of transmigration and nirvana, the Buddhist theory, but the common belief that there could be good life after one's death. It's interesting that when he's making the same appeal, putting the same moral principles in his Kandhar edict, one version of which is in Aramaic and one is in Greek, In the Aramic version, he promises that you will have no difficulty in facing the judgment, the last days, the judgment of the last days. Remember that many of the Semitic principles to Semitic beliefs, notably in the day of judgment, come from Iran, from early Iranian religion, Zoroastrianism. And therefore, he knows that those Iranians who, also Zoroastrians, who are using Aramic would be looking forward to what happens in Day of Judgment. And therefore, he says, in your Day of Judgment, you will have no difficulty. But when the same edict is put in Greek, the same edict, he knows that the Greeks don't believe in afterlife. They, in fact, hardly believe in any religion. They are rationalists. Therefore, he makes no such offer. Neither judgment, nor heaven, nor paradise. Thus, this is good, therefore you do it. And I think this too is enormous width of mind and ability to approach people and knowing their beliefs. You see, in Ashokan inscriptions, there are again and again references to Yavanas, to Yonas. He is influenced, I think, by Greek culture indirectly, though this particular fact is hardly taken into consideration by historians. If Kharoshti came from Aramic, you must remember that Aramic was the language, the script containing the language that most Iranians spoke, and the Iranians were then in the Greek tutelage. And then, of course, there were the Greeks, whom also Ashoka addressed. And there was a Greek, Hellenized Greek, who was his governor of Gujarat, according to Rudradaman's inscription of 150 AD. And therefore, it's not only his moral teachings, it's also his width of vision. Then you come to various facts of administration, particularly when you see his appointment of Dharma Mahamatras, his insistence on public works. After all, when you just said in your remarks, then one may say something but not do it. But what prevented his successors, Kanishka and Samudragupta and Chandragupta, for celebrating their public works? Why did they not say themselves that we have dug wells, we are digging wells every 2 krosha, or every half krosha or kosas? We are providing shady trees on the roads. Why do not they say it? They don't even think of it. Look at the entire range of Gupta inscriptions. It is Ashoka who is taking pride in his public measures of public welfare. So I don't agree that just because he's claiming it, you can't believe that he really did it. But the very fact that he's claiming it sets him apart from all the other Indian rulers of ancient times who had Prakrit inscriptions, and then, of course, in Sanskrit, all kinds of verbosity, but never about works of public welfare. And then, notably, the total disregard of the caste system, total disregard. And then, of course, he is a Buddhist. As I said, in Bharat rock inscription, he takes the Buddhist formula. Then he certainly interfered in affairs of Buddhist Sangh, because in his late edicts, according to the dates that I would prefer, he succeeded to the throne in 270 BC. His conquest of Kalinga took place in around 262 BC. All these dates are in his regnal years. So Ashoka establishes a chronology, and then he has numbered years. So you can, for the first time, you have numbered years. And then around 642 or so, because these are late pillar inscriptions, he expelled some monks and nuns from the Buddhist Sangha. And that's perhaps his only great act of intervention. Nowhere does he refer to any large gathering of Buddhist Sangha, which is attributed to him by the Dipavamsha tradition. I think he held no such big conference. He would have mentioned it too. So clearly, he gave donations to Sangharamas. He doesn't hide it. But he also gave us Rock Edict 12, in which he says, which I think our politicians should read all the time, that your own religion is not glorified by your prejudices. You are attacking other religions. People of all religions should study each other's religion and be friendly to each other. They need not quarrel. Rock Edict 12 is, I think, a very important piece of advice for us Indians who have had religious traditions. But I can't leave that subject without a joke. Indians, in their language, had no word for religion. Up till Buddhism, Jainism, and Ajivikas came along, this was no problem. Dharma could do for everything, doctrine and morality and so on, everything. But now when there were these four religions, what do you call them? Now they abused each other. The Brahmins called them Pashandas, and that is Hindi Pakhand, frauds. And they in turn called Brahmins Pashandas. So they had the same word of abuse for each other. Ashoka uses the word Pasanda in Prakrit form for the religious sect in Rock Edict 7 as well as in Rock Edict 12. And this is a very interesting point, that he couldn't find any word. He couldn't say dharma. Dharma was for him morality. And therefore the only word for religion he uses is pasanda, fraud. As a rationalist, I think it is a very good designation, but this was not perhaps the intention of Ashoka. Finally, his contribution to Indian culture, to Indian art. I mean, how can that be forgotten? If only that had remained, that would have been greatness. See, whatever he touched turned into gold. So if you look at architecture, stone architecture in India starts with Ashoka. There are no such buildings earlier. The caves in hillsides which he built, the polish that, and remember that those caves he built for Ajivikas. 2 of them are actually donated to Ajivikas. And perhaps also the third, but that doesn't carry an inscription. That doesn't carry, the word donation to Ajivikas, but carries the date. So you have these immensely well-constructed cave structures. Then you have the pillars. Just see the art in the pillars. The plane, the whole pillar is plain. Unlike the Iranians, he doesn't spoil the effect by over ornamentation. The ornamentation is at the top only. Its capitals, pillar capitals, are masterpieces of art. And of course, you have then the 4 lions at Sarnath. And before I proceed about them, I should like to recall that John Marshall, the Director General of Archaeology, was an expert in ancient Greek and Roman archaeology. He knew ancient art very closely before he came to India. And he says that as far as these 4 lions are concerned, the Sarnath lions, there's no parallel in the whole range of ancient art. We have just seen that you can't reconstruct it. That is the Sarnath lions, you just reconstruct it, you totally spoil the effect. You make them from friendly lions, you make them snarling lions, and you don't have even the balance which is there in Ashoka with the base and the main structure. You just free from them, this example, our ability in 2022 and that man's ability or his craftsman's ability in 245, let us say, BC. I mean, that is art. For the first time, you have animals portrayed in stone. And all the time, there's no over-ornamentation. You see, unfortunately, over-ornamentation is one of the weaknesses of Indian art. But there's nothing like over-ornamentation in Ashoka. He uses plain spaces, for example, his pillars, with such effect, so that the capitals become so important. And therefore, if he had left nothing but his sculptures and structures, he would still have been great. Well, thank you. If I would certainly welcome objections and questions.
No, thanks a lot for that. So you make a very convincing argument there that we shall never know whether or not Ashoka lived up to his ideals. But even the fact that he framed these ideals for himself and for his state in itself makes him great. Nobody prior to him or after him, at least in recorded history, seems to have had the mindset to come up with ideals which are based on universal values and human rights. And I believe not only in India, but anywhere in the world. So that's a very convincing argument. But I do want to go back and question on some of the things that you've said. So one thing, you started off with saying that he brought writing to India, the Brahmi script and the Kharosthi script. Is it possible that writing had all been around for a much longer time? And what Ashoka did was that instead of writing on papyrus, whatever, sort of like the leaves and the wood, he decided to use stone as the medium, which has lasted all these 2 millennia.
This would have been possible if there had been any reference to writing in the vast Sanskrit literature. All Sanskritists agree that writing is first referred to by Panini, whose date is usually 240 BC, 340 BC. But even that is perhaps too early. And Panini belonged to Gandhara, where Aramaic used. You must remember that writing in the Iranian Empire was there from around 550 BC earlier also. So Aramaic was certainly there, and Panini must have known. So first of all, if there was any writing known, Panini is the first writer, and that's as late as 340. And by that time, of course, in the Iranian Empire, to which Gandhara belonged for most of the time, and then it passed under Greeks, writing was known. But Indians, in Indian languages, notably Sanskrit,
The east of Indus, yeah.
including Panini himself, were not writing.
And then,
his
yeah, sorry.
no, when you see writing, once writing begins, it will be preserved in some form or the other. People will say we are writing, as Ashoka says. And Ashoka's then writing is not incidental, it's whole texts. It's
But what would
almost
be the logic?
Ashoka's inscriptions, edicts almost make up a book, a volume.
Well, what would be the logic of investing so much in putting up these edicts in writing if you know the masses can't read, right? Like the only reason you would try to send the messages in writing is because you believe that the masses can actually read.
No, I think they are also, I would differ. Writing was spreading for words. Now we know Sri Lanka already in 100 years earlier than Ashoka, possibly in Tamil Nadu. But they were words. What Ashoka did was that and the Brahmi script existed, but Ashoka greatly reframed the Brahmi script by introducing vowel sounds in it, signs in it, by completing it, by also providing for many consonants, and then having texts in it. He's the first person who writes. As far as common knowledge of writing, spread of it, I too was an unbeliever until I came across a very interesting inscription at Ramgarh in central India. There was a poor artist who lived in a cave there, and he has left an inscription in Ashokan Brahmi. It is Ashokan Brahmi to the hilt. And the inscription is a short one, Sutanaka Devdasi. I love you. I'm an artist from Varanasi. I love you. First romantic inscription. An artist writing it in totally poor artist from Varanasi. It means that writing had spread much more than we would otherwise think. Otherwise, this inscription wouldn't be there. To whom was he writing? Who would be reading his inscription if writing was not being read? Why should he write it? And the fact is, Cunningham first noticed it. Unfortunately, ancient Indian historians don't notice these things, and there are huge implications. Writing must be, this chap is writing because he expects people to read it. And he's leaving a message. And therefore, I would argue that writing began to spread very fast. Just as the use of paper, when it came ultimately through the Arabs from China to India, spread very fast.
So we can believe. So basically, the point is that during the modern times, writing was spreading fast. Brahmi script on the east of Indus, and the Kharosthi script to the west of Indus, and he's the first person in recorded history who decides to choose this medium to communicate with the vast masses that he now has in his realm.
And probably the last one.
Okay.
Nobody else, everybody else communicated only their greatness, how great they were, how many titles they had, what was and for a certain period, they were not concerned that their father's Gotra, but because that was only doubtful, but their mother's Gotra, who for Brahman. That's a particular period in which they were most interested in. So the caste system. But Ashoka has nothing about the caste system.
You don't think this is because of the Buddhist influence on him that he does not place any importance on the caste? Could it just be the Buddhist influence on him?
No, because the Buddhists did place importance to the caste. In fact, Gautama Buddha said that Kshatriyas shouldn't. He praises Kshatriyas for their
specific tasks and duties assigns to different wherever your level of society, your level in society.
He doesn't assign that, but he doesn't attack the caste system either.
Okay.
And generally it has been said that Buddhist Sangha was full of Brahmans and Kshatriyas.
Okay.
And Ahimsa doctrine was used by the votaries of the caste system to make peasants from Vaishyas into Shudras. You probably know in the Dharma Shastra, like Manusmriti, it is said because the peasant, when plowing, destroys life through the plow. Therefore, they can be only Shudras. So the Ahimsa doctrine is now utilized by in favor of the caste system. And the Brahmins and the Buddhists also, according to I Ching, the Chinese traveler, regarded peasants as low caste because of this, because the plow, according to them, and watering the fields killed insects. So Buddhists had made their peace with the caste system.
Got you. So I want to go further on this specific topic about like the edicts, because there are many people who believe that the edicts were a way of self-aggrandizement, as you've mentioned about like later rulers who were using writing only to do boasting and self-propaganda. So there is a view that maybe if there is some truth to the Buddhist texts from later, that Ashoka was so brutal that he was called Chanda Ashoka, who the fierce Ashoka. He was probably trying to compensate for that really bad PR that he had by putting up all these good propaganda about himself to position.
But that view of Ashoka was in Buddhist tradition. Buddhist tradition because of before his conversion to Buddhism. As far as Ashoka is concerned, his self-criticism is about the Kalinga annexation, not about anything. Buddhist tradition says he killed his brothers. Ashoka's inscription referred to his brothers' establishments and how Dharma Mahamatras would be sent to serve his brothers' establishments. So clearly, the Buddhist tradition is totally wrong in saying that he killed off his brothers, all his brothers. So Buddhist tradition about his harshness and cruelty relates to his earlier years in order to show that the great change that came over him. But this is not Ashoka's story. Ashoka says that his remorse came when his conquest of Kalinga, which according to Megasthenes was a powerful kingdom, and so many people got killed.
But even after, like the Buddhists obviously don't mean it in a wrong way, but even after his supposed transformation, the Buddhists go on sharing stories where he massacred 18,000 heretics who did not conform to being the proper Buddhist, or that he asked every Jain's head to be beheaded and given to him in return for a gold coin, or that he kills so many Ajivikas in one single episode. And like there's just so many stories, and the Buddhists are obviously saying, "Oh, what a righteous king! He's killing all the bad Jains and bad Ajivikas."
Actually, we know that he gave but we know he gave three caves, and certainly 2 caves to the Ajivikas.
Yeah, which is why it's
in his last inscription, which is probably his last one, Pillar Edict 7. He specially mentions not only Ajivikas, but also the Jains, Migranthas, the naked ones. So clearly, and that he's supporting them. A man who would be killing Ajivikas and Nigranthas would not mention them, especially in his edict, along with the Sangha and the Brahmans, Shamanas and the Brahmans. Because naturally, if he's an opponent of them, why would he mention, especially that he was giving them assistance? And what about his Rock Edict 12? Why would he write that edict? So
that the people should respect other religions and they shouldn't try to disparage other religions. Things
and
like
I
that.
particularly like his using the word pasanda for religion, because he couldn't find any other term. But it's surprising how Indian scholarship doesn't note that Pasanda is being used for religion, the word, and its
Right.
implications.
Yeah.
So actually, we have not learned enough about Ashoka. There's much more to learn.
But that still gives me rise to two more questions. First, why, in your view, so many centuries later, why did Buddhists appropriate this historical figure in such a big way? And then why have the other traditional sources like the Puranas and all, why have they ignored him? Why doesn't he get, if he's so consequential, why doesn't he get much discussion in the non-Buddhist, non-Shramana sources?
Actually, Puranas were compiled in about 2nd or 3rd century AD because they just mention Gupta's earliest Puranas.
Yeah.
And they only say who succeeded whom.
Yeah.
They don't go out to praise Chandragupta Maurya, for instance. They had no idea, unlike Indian filmmakers, that Chandragupta and Chanakya were great nationalists who threw out the Greeks. Even Arthashastra, Kautilya himself had no such idea in Arthashastra. So clearly,
but even in Gupta period, Chandragupta Maurya was idealized. There was a lot of revivalism of the Chandragupta Maurya and all the discussion around that. But it seems like they were trying to model them.
Not at all. Not at all. No. There was a legend about Chanakya,
Right.
and also called Kautilya. A legend that is not borne out by what goes above the text, that is Arthashastra. But there was no idea that Greeks were thrown out, Yavanas were thrown out by Chandragupta Maurya. All this has come after we learned from Greek accounts that when Seleucus came, he found that Chandragupta had overthrown the
Indo-Greeks
or Greek satraps in the Indus Valley, Sandrakotas. It is from there that our great nationalists have found in Chandragupta and Kautilya their precursors. It is from the Greek, 2 or 3 sentences in the Greek accounts. So this is all manufactured.
Okay, so I take your argument that the Puranas were not interested in his chronological history, and they're not discussing about details of different rulers. That's not a matter that they were focused on. Agreed. But then why did Buddhists try to appropriate this hundreds of years old historical figure in such a big way, both in the North Indian tradition and in the Sri Lankan tradition?
Sri Lankan, it can be easily explained because he brought Buddhism. He was supposed to have brought Buddhism to Sri Lanka.
So he had to be glorified, and like how he
Sri Lanka, Tambapani, twice in his inscriptions. But he also mentions Pandyas and
the Cholas.
Cholas and Pandyas and Kerala Putras and so on in his inscription. So there's no particular emphasis on Sri Lanka. But Buddhism came to Sri Lanka through Ashoka, and Ashoka's son was supposed to have gone there as a bhikshu. But as far as the northern or the Mahayan tradition is concerned, I think the memory of Ashoka must have remained in the north also, because after all, by his grants to the Sangha and the fact that he puts Buddhism and Brahmans together, and although he mentions Ajivikas and gave grants to Ajivikas, and also mentions grants to Jains, I think for the first time, a ruler had put Brahmanism and Buddhism at par. And that must have been an important thing, which affected
for the Buddhists.
for Buddhists also and the tradition in India. Buddhism certainly became an important religion. And then you can also see that after Ashoka, Buddhism seems uh, to score over Brahmanism as
Yeah.
far as Sangharamas are concerned, cave temples are concerned, viharas concerned. Many of them now converted into Brahman temples. But, and therefore, it is from Ashoka that the great surge of Buddhism begins, which only begins to wear out by the 4th century AD.
So Ashoka had elevated Buddhism to almost an equivalent level to the other mainstream religions in India. And he was the one spreading the message of Buddhism, perhaps not just Buddhism, of other religions also. But so it was important for the Buddhist monks or evangelists to show that, look, how this guy was completely transformed. He was the most violent sort of guy before Buddhism touched him and turned him into this nice,
I
great
think
saint.
he, I would still think that his picture of being a violent tyrant is all manufactured. In religious tradition, you always emphasize the evilness of a person because
Yes,
before you came to that religion.
exactly.
It's
That
not,
it was
it's
meant
not
for the
the form, it's
drama
not
purpose.
Buddhism, it's basically every religion. Because before conversion, you are most evil, after conversion, you are most angelic.
No, exactly. That's what I was saying. So it was
So, but
important for him to show
let us
that.
go by what Ashoka says himself. Ashoka refers to the slaughter at Kalinga, which is not mentioned at all in Buddhist sources.
Yeah.
So clearly Buddhist sources are suspect. If they were genuine, they would have mentioned Kalinga.
So here's the interesting thing about the Kalinga massacre. Ashoka explicitly says that he regrets what he did in all the inscriptions except the ones that are in Orissa. So, and this has been pointed by some people that this is suspicious, that if he genuinely felt remorse, why does he not mention the specific lines about regret and remorse in the inscriptions that were there in that area?
The only thing is that 12, Rock Edict 12 and 13, Rock Edict 11, 12, and 13, this, but including Rock Edict 13, is not found in the two places in Orissa where the other rock edicts are found. Instead of that, there are two separate edicts. So it is believed that these two separate edicts promising peace to the people of Kalinga replaced Rock Edict 13. I agree, it might have been politic, not
Right.
to complicate
You
matters.
don't want your authority to be
Because
questioned.
even in Rock Edict 13, he's still saying that people in the forest should stop resisting, otherwise they would be killed.
Yes, I wanted to get
He
to
would
that.
not,
The
yes,
veiled threats in his
so
edicts.
he might not have liked Rock Edict 13 because of this particular warning to be put in Odisha. Now the question to be asked is, if he did not want it to be put in an inscription in Odisha, why did he put the warning at all? Because putting a warning in a rock edict, which you are setting up in near Texila, doesn't make sense. So Rock Edict 13 has a warning about
The
killing
Adivasis, the forest people.
the forest folk if they continue to resist. But on the other hand, the separate edicts for Orissa, which by the way, fragments of which have been found in the Deccan now also, they seem to be designed to pacify the conquered population. I mean, also see by what Rock Edict 13 has been replaced.
Yeah. What is it? What was it?
These are documents which are designed to pacify the local population.
Right. So there is that politics definitely involved, and I think it's noticeable that although he says he has renounced the use of force and violence, But he says, well, don't think you can still not obey me, because if
No,
you
no,
don't,
he
then there
never
is a way.
says, no, he never says he has renounced. No, no, never. Nowhere.
But he embraces
He
ahimsa.
said that I will not invade.
Okay.
Not
But the forest people who are
this conquest,
literally under his.
not this conquest, but dharma vijay, dhamma vijay. I am now in that conquest, and my sons and successors should also do this. But he never says that he will not protect his dominions. In fact, he says that I am in debt to the people, a kind of social contract theory. Very interesting statement. I am in debt to my people, and my officers are in debt to me. I mean, look at the statements he's making. Nowhere does he say that he will dissolve the army. Nowhere he says that he won't march. He even says that if you go on resisting, you will be killed.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So there is this threat of use of
He is
force.
governing an empire. He's
And
not abandoning army. Nowhere does he say that I'm abandoning armed force.
But these people that he to whom he's speaking, are they always really his subjects? Like, are the forest people technically his subjects? Or when he puts up these pillars in South India, did he really have a governing power in South India, or was this like a way to dominate people even beyond your Bob?
No, there is no question of domination, but it is clear that he had power. There is this interesting case of a scribe who has inscribed inscriptions in the south, and then he signs in Kharoshti. So he's obviously a northwesterner who is employed in the south for putting Brahmi inscriptions, but he himself signs in Kharoshti. So,
So actually,
this is a functioning empire.
But this is a very important topic I wanted to ask you about. So you talked about earlier that when he's putting up edicts in Northwest, he's very aware of the cultural sensitivities there, the kind of language. When he writes in Greek, he writes in
Afghanistan. This is Kandahar.
Yeah,
he held most of Afghanistan.
Exactly. So when he's writing in Aramaic and in Greek, he's very aware of the cultural nuances, whether they care about afterlife or not, or what's their concept of Judgment Day. But at the same time, he does not show this cultural awareness, either deliberately or not, when he puts his edicts in South India. Is that something that he looked down upon South Indians, while he respected edicts and
he put his edicts in the same text as in North India, except that in South India, he has what is called minor rock edict 2, which is only found in a large number of places in South India, but not in North India. There doesn't seem to be any reason why he did not have this minor rock edict 2 inscribed in North India. Nobody has yet given a reason, nor could I find the reason. So otherwise, in South India, he had put the same inscriptions as in North India. To him, there was no difference, except
but he
that
doesn't use the Dravidian idiom or anything like that, right? He continues to use Brahmi Script, the North Indian, or like you said, he's appointing a Kharoshti
but Tamil Brahmi, Tamil Brahmi, the first Brahmi script in Tamil, which is Tamil Brahmi, is still Brahmi.
Right, but it
derives from Ashokan Brahmi.
Okay.
And is only confined basically to Madura territory, Madurai. So clearly, whether it is Punjab or Gujarat or Karnataka, the local languages must have been different. They couldn't have been Prakrit.
Right. Okay, so you're saying he's just using these as a central language of the empire.
What differences are in these dialects? For instance, la only, all are converted into L. In classical Brahmi, Ashokan Brahmi in the Gangetic Valley, but are being used properly in the south, in the peninsula, and in Gujarat. These were variations of what would be called official language. They couldn't have been the popular language. You couldn't have the same language over such a large area.
But he does extend that respect and regard to the Greeks and the Aramaics, the Achaemenids. To there, he decides to actually use their language and their thought process and write the inscription for them in their language. Is that because that area was not so?
Because they had already. He knew that they had a language, they had a script, and they had books.
So there was that regard, cultural regard for
cultural
sure.
regard. I mean, Ashokan art would not have been present if there had not been any Greek art and Iranian act. You can see many things are derived from Iranian and Greek art.
Right.
And this is one of the major things of importance, how Ashoka was aware of those things. This is
probably they were like this cultural superpowers of that age.
You didn't have photographs and so on. So how did he know? Why did he have the same kind of things, the same kind of floral design, but totally changed and improved? One doesn't know. He might have Iranian and Greek artists, we don't know.
And there are people who believe that he appointed Yavanas, the Greeks, in his administration, and some people even go as far as to speculate that his own palace may have been modeled after the Achaemenid palace in Persepolis.
Because there are traces of pillars, but whether that actually was Ashoka's palace cannot be established because there is no inscription. But clearly the art is influenced by Iranian and Greek art. Clearly. But again, Ashoka has his own contribution. The floral designs which they put at the bottom, Iranians, he puts at the top. And everything is changed. And the whole pillar is simple. It's not ornamented. Where did he get that particular?
Right.
Those plain surfaces are not there in Iranian art. The floral designs are taken from Iran, yes, but where does he get the idea of having a plain surface? It's unique.
And that's the aesthetic sense we directly connect with, the Mauryan aesthetics. Okay.
No, whether of his own or whether of his Minister of Culture, I don't know. But it is there.
And while we were on his edicts, just wait. One last question I wanted to ask was about something that strikes out as quite intriguing. The concept of these dharma monitors, the dhamma mahamatas that he appointed, or I think these people who were in charge of ensuring that the dharma was followed, whatever his concept of dharma was. But it seems like they had immense power to punish people, to even give out death sentences. And he says that if somebody is given death sentences, the relatives have the opportunity to come convince of their innocence or whatever, which seems to me like an opportunity to bribe the official, right? Like,
I don't think he has ever said that Dhamma Mahamatras have the power to punish. I don't remember any such statement. I've read the inscriptions again and again, but there's no such inscription. Dhamma Mahamatras were appointed, he says, first to spread Dhamma doctrine, then to look after charities of his own brothers and sisters and sons and daughters and others, state charities, then also to deal with grants to Shramanas, Brahmans, and Jains and Ajivikas. In Pillar Edict 7, actually, these are mentioned in relation, if I remember it right, in relation to the duties of Dhamma Mahamatras. it was not that Dhamma Mahamatras were to take up any violent action or any physical, any forcible action. He continues to regard Rajukas as his main officers, governing officers.
I stand corrected. So I'll quote one of the inscriptions where he's saying, just as a person feels confident having entrusted his child to an expert nurse, thinking that the nurse will keep my child well, even so the Rajukas have been appointed by me for the welfare and happiness of the people. But that sounds quite a lot like a nanny state, doesn't it?
No, you might say that it was an expectation. Rajukas must have been hard-headed men who looked at their own pockets also.
I mean, knowing the India that
But
I
that
know,
is what
Ashoka
expected them to do, as we expect our politicians to do without their doing it.
Yeah, that's the worldview acquired through our own experience.
So clearly, Ashoka might have had illusions or hopes, and Rajukas, being hard-headed men, all aware of what their pockets demanded, must have looked the other way. So I don't know. But you know, the very fact that Ashoka has a theory of social contract, I am in debt to my people. That's a very important statement. I mean, we all talk about Hobbes and others and Rousseau's social contract.
Yeah.
Here there is again an assertion of social contract, this debt theory. I don't think Ashoka has been praised enough for his ideas.
But it's also disturbing at one. Well, I get the ideals part, but the fact that the rulers making sure that I personally, as an individual, is following his moral code of ethics or moral code or ethical code in my personal life in terms of what I eat and what I don't. And there are these people out there who are going to be monitoring what I'm eating and what I'm doing. Am I respecting the elders or not, or whatnot? That's disturbing to me. That's what I resent.
That monitoring is our assumption.
Right. Yeah, of course. We don't exactly know what
our assumption that they are monitoring. Most of the time, I suppose they were simply gobbling up resources, and I think Ashoka's expectations of their Rajukas or even Dhamma Mahamatras were probably misplaced. But that he had those expectations, I think, is itself very important. Humanity has several ideas, and to have these ideas and to have these notions, why doesn't any other ruler in ancient India do it? Why don't they similarly say that they will do it? They all assert their power, authority, their victories over others. You look at another inversions, you look at Gupta inscriptions, you look at Samudragupta inscription. Does he say anywhere that I am going to serve the people? In the great Allahabad inscription.
I'm just going to be a devil's advocate just for the sake of it. And it's like a loud thinking thought. The fact that you said that he's really impressed with the Achaemenid Empire, it is from that part of the world where we see that rulers are trying to speak to posterity. There are these megalomaniacs who have been living in, who were there in Persia, who built these great structures, not necessarily because it was doing anything in their immediate realm, but it was something to talk to posterity because of the megalomania. Is it remotely possible in your mind that Ashoka, because of his influence of the Persian and Achaemenid culture, he had acquired that kind of desire to leave a mark for posterity, and which has clearly worked. But whereas the other guys, Samudragupta and all, were just busy doing whatever they're in their own specific life, taking care of their immediate worldly needs, as opposed to.
It's clear that he was influenced by Achaemenid art, and it's also clear that he was influenced by Greek, because the Greek realism, let me say, the Greek realism in art, both are influenced. Of course, he I think there was some prejudice against India at that time for making statues. So human beings
There
are
was a
not.
prejudice in India against making statues.
No, there was a prejudice.
Yeah, that's
Human
prejudice
figures.
against statues.
I don't
What?
know. Human figures, because Ashokan art doesn't have human figures, but animals are portrayed.
Okay.
So
So we
and,
assume there might have been some kind
and
of
there is
cultural.
the first human frame with Mauryan polish doesn't belong to Mauryan times, but belongs to the 1st century AD, in
Okay.
which a girl is portrayed with Mauryan polish. By the way, Mauryan polish has not been yet discovered.
We haven't figured out how they were polishing these statues, how they look so smooth.
What did it contain? We don't know.
Oh wow, that's fascinating. I had no idea.
Mauryan polish has not been detected.
So
it has not been.
we don't specifically know this, so it's basically we assume that there might have been some cultural reluctance in depicting human forms at that time, in the Mauryan time.
Actually, one can trace it through Gautama Buddha. Human forms are certainly present in early representation in Bharut Stupa, which is 2nd century BC starting. They are present.
And even in the Indus Valley civilization, we do find.
Indus Basin is totally different. I mean, that's a different culture.
It's not good.
That is nothing, no relationship with. That is how many 1500 years earlier. They probably didn't know about. And so they were portrayed, but Buddha was not portrayed.
Right.
But in Ashokan art, no human figure appears. So there was a prejudice, I think, against, for some reason or the other.
Okay.
Against human art. And then this lingered on as far as Gautama Buddha was concerned. And then finally, under Greek influence, Gandhara art, Gautama Buddha also began to have statues.
Very realistic forms in Gandhar. And okay, so I want to ask you, like, we've talked about his ideals, but in your view, was he a successful administrator? Like, did he actually run the empire well? Because at one point we think it was probably the biggest expanse of the Indian empire in antiquity, but at the other, it crumbled soon after he died. So did he leave it so weak, unlike his predecessors from whom he inherited a pretty strong, stable empire? So like there's two views around it. One view is that perhaps because he became a pacifist, he couldn't keep up the empire. And so that, I think that has been dismissed by many historians, including Romila Thapar. And then there is the other view that because he was so violent and people were rebelling everywhere, left and right, the empire had to go right after he died, sort of similar to what happened with Aurangzeb. So what is your view on this? Like, do you think that he was a good administrator, or was this all ideal and he didn't even come close to implementing all these ideals in actual life?
So you see, as far as the Mughals are concerned, you have very detailed history. There's no problem as far as if you look at, but the Mauryans, you just don't have the records. So we can say anything.
It's all
we
conjecture.
Can say his successors divided the empire as it seemed, and so the Mauryan empire became very weak. We can also say that Ashoka didn't leave an army, but the previous belief that Ashoka began to lose territories, which, if I'm not mistaken, was also the thesis in Romila Thapar's first edition of Ashoka. At that time, the Ashokan inscriptions in Afghanistan had not been discovered. Those inscriptions suggest that actually his control over Afghanistan continued till very late years. And that of course means that as far as northern India was concerned, it's the southern India or the peninsula where actually the late inscriptions, there are no late inscriptions of his reign. I mean, none belonging to, say, late 240s BC. And that suggests that some areas in south might have left his grasp. But one can't say anything. It is true that there's nothing like pillar edicts in the Deccan. Pillar edicts came late in Ashoka's reign. If his accession was is placed in 270 BC, they came in 244 and 243 BC. So there is no inscription of that time in the peninsula. So why are there no pillar inscriptions in the peninsula? Either they have disappeared, because then you can say that there is an Amravati pillar, but that has been broken, so one can't read the inscription on it.
Right.
So long as this Amravati pillar is there, there is always an answer. So for the moment, until further discoveries are made, one can't say. But as far as Northwest is concerned, he was there. I think Professor Rumila Thapar was too harsh on him as far as his later inscriptions are concerned. That
in what way? Why?
She uses strong words like that. He was just praising himself and so on and so forth. And but losing control. But then Pillar Edict 7, if you read Pillar Edict 7, it is so clear-headed and well-arranged. This is his last edict. So I don't think Professor Rumila Thapar Day was just to him.
Right. Now, for my last question, I want to talk about, obviously, Ashoka's emblem, his lions, everything have been, and his chakra, the wheel of dharma, have made it into national flag and national emblem. So, and a lot of this has to do with the nationalist pre-independence. I think your camera, perfect. I'll give you a few minutes.
Yeah.
Not yet. It's still on. Okay, perfect. We have you back. So the nationalist leaders pre-independence, when they had to look for an iconic Indian ruler who ruled, an Indian ruler who ruled over most of India, and they were looking for an example and looking back in history, obviously, as everyone does, to show the continuity. Why did they choose Ashoka in your view? There were so many rulers across the history so long. Why specifically Ashoka? Why did they not choose Chandragupta, for example, who overthrew the foreigners and started an Indian empire, just as they were going to do after the British would leave?
I mean, if you think Nandas were foreigners, who would agree with you?
No, I mean like the
Nandas.
No, I mean like the Greeks, not the Nandas. I meant like
concerned, I mean, he made a
Alexander.
Peace. No, yeah. Alexander was not involved. Alexander died in Babylon, and
his descendants.
His empire remained intact until his death. And he was trying to invade. He would probably have overthrown the Nandas, but these forces didn't agree. And so, I mean, all this is envisioned that Chandragupta Maurya overthrew the Greeks in the Indus Basin. They divided, in the Seleucus divided the area, and certainly Chandragupta then incorporated the Greek satraps, you were mentioning this. Rudradaman's inscription refers to the Yona Raja, the Greek, a Persianized Greek because the name is Persian, who was governor of Gujarat under Ashoka. So they were incorporated into the ruling class. Whether they had, I don't think Chandragupta Maurya was so much in Nehru's eyes as Ashoka. You must remember that at that time it was not nationalists' opinion which counted, but it was Nehru with his discovery of India, with his autobiography, with his glimpses of world history, who looked at Ashoka in particular as an important figure of Indian history and Mauryan Empire as in particular. And his policy of secularism could be said to be related to Ashoka's policy of tolerance. So there were very good reasons for their choosing Ashoka. They didn't know that the lions, from being friendly lions, could be made fierce lions. They wouldn't know. But they had a different view of Ashoka.
I think it would be quite interesting to see the lions with each changing age. They change their expressions and stuff. So later on, for a historian, maybe 200 years later, they look back just the changing lion expression, and they'll be able to read so much into the times because so much is reflected into those lions, how Indian state evolved.
You don't think one feels proud that in 240 BC they had more skill than you have in 2022?
But you already told me this. You told me that
they could have all parts in much greater balance than we have.
But you already
this is a matter of pride.
You already noted this earlier. You said that the aesthetics of Ashokan art was not matched by subsequent art when things were over elaborate and stuff. In Indian art we see that. So you already pointed that it's not necessarily something that evolves towards the better. I think it goes up and down, and we can read about the aesthetics. From the aesthetic standards, we can read a lot about the conditions of those age, perhaps. So just to summarize it, I've often been asked by foreigners that why do you have this wheel-like thing in your flag, or why do you have this emblem? And I've usually just said there was an ancient king who probably got a lot of the empire. He probably the only ruler who had such a vast area, almost all of India or most of India under his control. And that is probably why we chose those symbols. But you've told me today that it's not that reason alone. It's basically the principles he introduced, how he moved into India, transformed India to move to another age, or the ideals he chose for himself and for the society. That's what makes him great. It's not the territorial expansion. It's the ideas or the ideas of religious tolerance, the ideas of caring not just for human subjects but for animals too. We shall never know whether or not that was all achieved in his lifetime. But the fact that there were these ideas already should make us proud of being Indians. But we are one of the earliest people where these ideas were brought and celebrated and chiseled into stone.
We were not the only people. I mean, if you read Confucius, you are surprised at his wisdom. Mm-hmm. And therefore, every country, every civilization has its parts. One needs to be proud of one's past, but one shouldn't overdo it. And certainly, Ashoka is a remarkable figure, very remarkable.
I absolutely agree with you there that one shouldn't overdo, and the past shouldn't be at the expense of downplaying others. And I think when these symbols were adopted, or when we moved out from colonialism into an independent state, at the time, I think they wanted to instill that kind of pride that we are no less than others. It's not to say that we are more than others, some sort of exceptionalism, but it's that we are no less than others, and we have a lot to be proud of.
Well, part of the reason was that the Congress flag had spinning wheel. And of course, they couldn't have the party flag there. So they wanted to have something to replace the spinning wheel, and Ashoka's wheel was very convenient. And then there was this Nehru's addiction, Nehru's high regard for the Mauryan Empire, but particularly Ashoka.
Yeah, I mean,
You can
from,
find. So it is
from
not a nationalist decision. It was, I think, Nehru's particular regard for history and the fact that Ashoka was not a Hindu. You could not say in 1947 that you are creating a Hindu nation. I think that's a very, that must have weighed in Nehru's mind.
and his explicit support for religious tolerance.
That is true, but in proclaiming Ashoka, you can't proclaim Hindutva. At that time, Hindutva was not there, but Hindu communalism was there, like Muslim communalism. Hindus and Muslims were killing each other on a grand scale. In that particular situation, Ashoka was a particularly attractive figure, both for his tolerance edict and both for the fact that you couldn't say that he belonged to the Hindu faith.
Actually, since you brought it up, I just noticed that there's a question from Professor Nadeem Rizavi right now in the live session. Why, according to you, sir, the Hindutva philosophy opposes including lessons on Ashoka in history textbooks? I wasn't aware of this, but that's a question from Professor Nadeem Rizavi. Why do you think
generally if I go by their ancient India textbook issued under the previous BJP government, then they think that Ashoka actually demilitarized the Mauryan Empire.
And pacifist argument.
And of course, at heart, the fact that he was not a Hindu strikes them. And they glorified Chandragupta Maurya and Kautilya.
But Kautilya himself was Ajivika. Isn't that, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought Chanakya was Ajivika.
No, nothing. Kautilya, you see, Chanakya and Kautilya are both used for the same person.
Yeah, no, I agree. But
in the Purana, the name is Kautilya. And in the Arthashastra, Kautilya and I think Vishnugupta.
But I assumed he was a Brahmin who was practicing Ajivika.
No, Ajivika. He was not an Ajivika.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, I don't think so. In Kautilya's Arthashastra, they are all denounced as Pashandas. It's only Ashoka
all the sects.
Pashanda as a neutral word for religion. Otherwise, Pashanda meant fraud. So Kautilya is harsh words for them. They can't live in towns. They must live outside. Whether Buddhists or Ajivikas, they were all Pashandas.
So Arthashastra prioritizes the Brahmanical hierarchy.
Yes, who generally follows the Dhamma Shastra.
And do you believe from a historical standpoint, do you believe Arthashastra was written in the Mauryan time? Or like many historians now believe that it was actually from the much later age?
Certainly not written in Mauryan times. It was, as has been now proved by detailed analysis, it was 2nd century. But it has some statements because in the 2nd century you had ordinary coinage, but you had that coinage because punch-marked coinage. So Arthashastra has reference to punch-marked coinage, and particularly the mixture of copper with silver, which took place in late Mauryan times. So since it took place in late Mauryan times, obviously this statement could not have been made in Chandragupta Maurya's time. But this is certainly much earlier than 2nd century AD. It must be first century BC or 2nd century BC. So there are early elements in Kautilya Arthashastra.
Some parts of it are older and some parts were probably added later.
Which is to be expected, because is a book which has been traditionally assembled, and in 2nd century AD, very meticulously re-edited.
Okay.
Very meticulously.
So a lot of the worldview of 2nd century AD gets reflected in it, and also the depending on whoever patronized this editing work.
Actually, 2nd century AD is very interesting because Manusmriti was also compiled at that time. Because Manusmriti mentions dynasties which did not exist in Mauryan times. They are all pre-Gupta dynasties. When he says that they were Kshatriyas but became Shudras, so Shakas and so on. So clearly Manusmriti is datable to 2nd century AD. Any earlier date is just not possible. And Arthashastra's language is very similar to those who studied. It is similar to Manusmriti. And then there are many statements which are obviously late.
So this is fascinating to me, as I think most nations start their kind of like, most people, I shouldn't even use the word nations, but most people create like a point in their history, real or mythical, to start their founding story, just like the Romans do with Romulus and Remus. And it's interesting that India post-independence, at that time, they decided to choose Ashoka as a sort of like a starting point from whom they wanted to sort of build on and draw in terms of like who we are as Indians. And now you're saying that the Hindutva side, they choose another king from the same dynasty just 2 generations before, so in Chandragupta Maurya. But both times we go back to the same exact dynasty in around 300 BC.
Well, there were many difficulties that early nationalists faced. Kautilya was a difficult figure because the caste system is so prominent in the Arthashastra. And therefore, Kautilya and Chandragupta Maurya didn't attract them. So, and I think it was Nehru's historic sense which prevailed in these matters. I don't think Sardar Patel was interested in history, except Somnath, but otherwise, not.
Okay. Well, look, we are at 90 minutes now, and this has been one of the most enlightening sessions for me. And you've made a very convincing case. Most of Indian history is now like an open area of debate these days. Everything is being questioned and everything is being challenged, and it's interesting because I think I've not seen people so much interested in history among the mainstream as it's happening now. So I think there is a lot of misinformation also coming, but also a lot of people have started like critically analyzing and questioning the conventional wisdom. And today you've made a very convincing case of why we call Ashoka great. And that does instill a sense of pride in me that a lot of our symbols, for whatever reasons that they decided to choose Ashoka, it's still something that makes me proud of our flag and our emblem, just from the historical lineage that they draw from Ashoka. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your kind remarks. Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. It's an absolute honor to have you with us today. Bye-bye. Namaskar.
Goodbye.